Welcome back to the ESG Decoded podcast. I'm Amanda and Hsieh, your co-host today, and I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Garry Cooper. He's the co-founder and CEO of Rheaply, a Chicago-based tech company that enables Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and universities to better visualize, quantify, and utilize their physical resources. He also serves on the board of directors at P33 Chicago and 1871, and the investor team at Long Jump Ventures, of which he's a founding partner. You may recognize Dr. Garry Cooper's name from a recent TED Talk called How to Make Sure Materials Get Reused Again and Again. Garry, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm so excited to be here with you. Hello, everyone.
I'm excited to dig into circularity with you and circular economy, these concepts, and of course how your approach to it. But maybe we can start off by, will you introduce us to Rheaply?
Yes, it's my favorite thing to talk about. So, Rheaply is, as you were saying, a Chicago-based technology company, really working on software kind of adjacent solutions to help large organizations and systems with this concept of reuse. So I'm sure a lot of your guests probably remember, from their elementary school training around reduce, reuse, and recycling. And it turns out that what we've probably done a lot of is build a lot of recycling infrastructure. People see that bin. People probably see the trucks that recycle things. It turns out that we can't recycle our way to net zero. So reuse is actually much better than recycling. We can talk about why that is. But it turns out we don't have the technology and infrastructure to reuse at scale. So that's what Rheaply is trying to build.
I love that because when I think about that classic triangle, right? First reduce, reuse, then recycle. And even when we think about recycling infrastructure in the US, there are certain materials that are highly recyclable, but there are other ones that are pretty common that we just don't have you can, but the infrastructure is not there. So I think reuse is also a way to address that issue.
Yes.
But I'm really excited to dig into this because I think it's something that we haven't explored as much in the podcast.
Right.
So I'm happy that you're here and can educate our listeners a little bit more about this. But let's unpack maybe some of these words first, so everyone's kind of on the same level before we dig into this. Will you tell us more about? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I always think about. I have a 97-year, about to be 98-year-old grandmother, and I always think about how can she understand what I'm doing. So I'm happy to go through many levels of examination and kind of unpacking a lot of the work that we do at Rheaply.
When you mentioned your grandma, yes. I think about my grandma too, and a lot of things were reused.
Oh yes. In fact, I have a LinkedIn newsletter called The Sustainable Business that I guess now almost 50,000 people subscribe to, and we wrote for Women's History Month. We wrote a piece about my grandmother and thinking about the role of how people used to do things. And it turns out that they were very resourceful, right? They were farmers. They were passing clothes down. They were thinking about different ways to repair and kind of upcycle their furniture. So I kind of use some heroic women in my life to kind of talk a little bit about like how sustainability around how circular economy and these terms of reuse don't have to be academic and theoretical. They're actually extremely practical. I mean, we're reusing things today, right? You reuse probably your utensils. You use them once, wash them, and use them again. The question is, how can we do that at scale? Not just at home, but also in the working world. And so when you start asking, well, we have a couch at my place of business, or I have a desk at my place of business, what happens to it when I don't use it anymore? Or that tool in the warehouse, or the warehouses that have many tools in it. What happens to those things when we clear out those warehouses? And so we just start, our belief at Rheaply is, if we start asking the question of where does these things go? Do I have something close to me that I can reuse the way that our grandmothers would 100 years ago? It actually will help us so much towards reducing our carbon debt of which every business and every person has to participate in order for us to get to net zero by 2050. But more broadly, produce a better working world, both from an efficiency margin perspective and also from a sustainable and environmental perspective. Less waste is better for everyone in business. So we actually think that the circular economy, as I would explain to my grandmother, or reuse, is just about being thoughtful about what you're purchasing. Do I need to purchase it, or does someone have it next to me? And what you're discarding. Does someone need what I have? And what we hope to do at Rheaply is to make both those questions. Does someone have what I'm looking for? Does someone need what I have? As easy as possible to answer for any person trying to be sustainable.
I think that's bringing it from our grandmothers right to the modern
Mm-hmm.
day. And your initial question of how do we scale this? That's the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not just in our homes, but scaling it and needing technology
Right.
to help us connect in a more efficient way. So, Garry, I think one of the things about that I'm think about with a circular economy is the way we can redesign this economic system, and there's many benefits from that, and that's fascinating to me. One of the things I think about is how we can redesign it to be more inclusive
Mm-hmm.
economic
Mm-hmm.
system. Would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah. So the current economy that we're in is so-called the linear economy, where we take things from the ground, we make things with those raw materials into products. After selling them, a consumer will waste them, will throw them away. So it's a straight line from ground back to ground. And what happens in that economy is we've gotten really good at harvesting things from the ground, and we've gotten really good at selling things. And unfortunately, we got really good at putting things in landfills. And where those landfills tend to be in neighborhoods and communities on the very front line of the climate fight. Whether those are lower income areas, whether those are areas where racial minorities tend to habitate. So I think though the current economy has been a great uh, force in driving innovation, it's left out a lot of communities and participating in it. And then those very same communities are actually being harmed by it. That their health is worse in these communities. And so what the circular economy pretends is actually to drive more economic output, right? To drive more GDP. So it's not reducing the power of the economy, it's to get more out of it. And where we get the more out of it is by utilizing the waste that's going into those landfills as a product of themselves. So the question is, instead of sending things to a landfill, can we do something else with them? Can we repair those items? Can we remanufacture those items? Can we refurbish those items? If not, can we then recycle those items? And just by asking that question, you unlocked two things, at least. One, a whole lot of economic power, because who's going to repair them? Who's going to remanufacture them? Who's going to refurbish them? Oh, those are going to be people who need to get those jobs and get job training. A second is, now I can sell something, right, that was going to the landfill of zero value, and I can sell that into an economy. And most important to me, and I think a lot of people on the front lines of the circular economy fight, is now we don't have those things going to those communities in a landfill, creating a lot of methane gas and a lot of extremely poor health outcomes for those communities. So I like to say, instead of sending trash to communities, we start to send value, because they can use the things that were going to go to landfill either as a new entrepreneur in a repair remanufacturing kind of perspective, or a person selling items that were once going to be in a landfill to a consumer. And so I think there's just such a really, really big opportunity beyond the waste management of reuse and recycling when it comes to circularity. And it has to do with being more inclusive to the economies that were underserved in the linear economy. But it's not by being unintentional. So one of the things that we try to do at Rheaply when we go into cities and trying to help them with circularity is we try not to just involve, the architects, the general contractors, the city government, like the people who are, I think, are typically polled for their feedback. But we try to involve, the NAACP, the local NAACP, the local EPA chapters, some of the sustainability groups, some of the neighborhood leaders, because really what we want to do is make sure that as we transition every city's economy from linear into a circular one, that we're doing so by including as many voices that were affected by the linear economy, so they can actually benefit in a circular one. But it's just such a better business model for every business. It's a better model to run a city or any government. And so, honestly, I don't know why more cities and more companies aren't being circular outside of it's gosh darn hard. You need technology, and that's kind of where we get back to at Rheaply to help scale that.
I want to ask you another question about circularity that I hear about is that it can help with climate resiliency and adaptation. Will you share some more about that? I'm curious about understanding that better.
Yeah, so there's two ways that empirically we've seen the resiliency part of circularity come into play. I'm sure there's more, but one that I think people can maybe wrap their heads around. So the first had to do with the COVID outbreak. So unfortunately, your listeners might remember, back in the very early parts of 2020, when we understood that we needed ventilators, right? And we needed PPE. You literally had governors go on televisions and say, hey, if you got a ventilator, call this number, right? If you have PPE, call this number. So we didn't know where all the ventilators were in our communities. We didn't know where all the PPE is. So that is an exact example of why circularity is important. One, because in order for circularity to work, and I talk about this in the TED Talk, we have to know where everything is. Just like we know where every home is through Google Maps and every road is, we have to know where things are. We can't make things circular if we don't know about them. So I think the COVID experiment showed us how we don't really know where things are. Now, what we did at Rheaply with the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot at the time, we used our technology to construct a local PPE marketplace for small businesses and nonprofits who were looking to reopen in the summer of 2020, but who couldn't find PPE at Walgreens, CVS, or Amazon because they were all on back order because we all wanted PPE. And they didn't have the purchasing power to order directly from a supplier overseas. So, but it turns out there were local suppliers of PPE, whether that be your brewery that started making hand sanitizer, whether that be a seamstress or a dry cleaner that started making masks. So what we did it with our technology is we essentially posted all the inventory from local PPE makers in Chicago, and we invited over 3,000 small businesses and nonprofits who were looking for that. In over 60 days, we were able to transact more than 200,000 pieces of PPE to those businesses just locally, as helping them get through the PPE shortage in the summer of 2020. So one thing that's local circularity can help is providing visibility to what's available, and then being able to use that in a kind of reaction to like a global pandemic where there's a scarce resource. The other way is in disaster relief. So you think about when a storm comes through and, unfortunately, painstakingly, homes are destroyed, resources are scattered about. So what we've seen is, okay, how can we use our neighborhoods that are surrounding maybe an affected area for people to say, hey, I have some clothing, I have some canned goods, I have all these things. I can put it on a platform, and then the people in the affected area can ask for that. Also, when we do the cleanup of a disaster area, of the homes, all the wood, all the furniture you've seen thrown about, where does all that stuff go? Well, it typically just goes into a dumpster, and the dumpster is going to go typically into that landfill I talked about before. So we think we have answers, and we've done a project with Goodwill on that in Florida. So after a hurricane, so we think that there's circularity is a good adaptive solution for climate and a good mitigator. And so we think that on the side of disaster relief and on the side of responding to hopefully once in a lifetime global pandemic, knowing what is around you and your communities, neighborhoods, and business, having it accessible to everyone provides a very simplistic solution to operate circularity in response to something that's happened, unfortunately.
I think you gave a really powerful stat in your TED Talk, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but the idea was that if we are able to achieve local, let's say kind of city or regional wide, we don't have to boil the whole ocean,
Right.
but if we're able to achieve this in our major cities around the world, it's something like it'd get us, I'm going to botch the number, like 40% towards the Paris goals.
Yes.
I don't know. I think you know the number
Yes.
better than I do.
Yes.
But
Yeah. So that's why I'm so passionate about this, because it's actually so simple. We don't have to build trillions of dollars of new infrastructure to get a long way towards getting back on step for the Paris Accord agreement target. So here's how I think about it. About 2018, a study published that the world was about 9.1% circular. 9.1%. 5 years later, in 2023, same study says that we're 7.2% circular. So we're almost 20% less. And I would say there's more investment, there's more people talking about circularity. So how is it that we've gotten 20% less versus 20% better? And I think that that's because we're all after this, quote, global circularity, which needs to happen. However, the question is, how does that happen? And I think trying to connect supply chains, value chains, 5,000 miles apart is not the first step. I think the first step is making our most local communities circular. We think at Rheaply that starts with the business. Inside of a business, it needs to be circular. That business then resides in a community, in a city. That city needs to be circular. And if you can just get those two things to work, cities and businesses to be circular, you have these amazing potential outcomes. And so to your point, in the TED Talk, I talked about, well, how many cities, if they were actually circular, would confer to how much CO2 reduction? So it turns out by just 2040, so not tomorrow, we have some time, if we can get 1,000 cities to be circular, we can reduce global carbon emissions by up to 63%. So over half the way towards our Paris Accord agreement to net zero. So it's really cool. So you ask the question, like, one might be asking the question, well, why cities? Well, what would we need to make a circular economy? Again, just an economy where we're sharing things that we were going to throw away and that we're being thoughtful about what we purchase. Well, you would need a lot of resources for things and a lot of people to be in the same place. And it turns out that's what cities are. Cities only account for about 3% of global landmass, but house over 50% of the global population are in cities. And 75% of all global resources go through cities. So they're the perfect kind of front for us to start circularity. All the people, or most of the people are there, and 3/4 of the resources are there. And there's small places to do this over, so you don't have a lot of logistical and travel barriers. So that's why I'm so passionate about cities and companies being the kind of unit test to how we connect the global circular economy, and not having a global circular economy be the first thing that we're tackling. Because again, we've had several years at that, decades at that, and we're no better than we were 5 years ago. In fact, we're 20% worse.
You talked about what we need to make this happen. Part of it is the technology,
Yep.
which I'm glad Rheaply is there for.
Yes.
Are there any other things that you think, like, we need this to change in order to really achieve this? What else would be on the top besides technology of your list?
So I think we're going to need software companies like Rheaply. So I think there's three things. I think we're going to need software companies like Rheaply. But those software companies only survive if we have broadband, fully accessible internet. So you wouldn't even think that being able to connect, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in the South Side of Chicago, is an important ingredient. It is. Everyone has to be connected because everyone needs to know about the stuff all over the place. That's the first step. The second step is we're going to need more infrastructure, right? We're going to need more people to ship things locally. We're going to need more people to repair and refurbish and remanufacture things locally. We're going to need more architects who are building buildings to think about circularity and adaptive reuse in their project planning. We're going to need more general contractors to be using reused recycled material in building. So, but in order for that to happen, we're going to have to train a workforce, and we're going to have to position those, that new workforce in a place where they can use that inventory. That's the second bullet. The third is we're going to have smart public policy that encourages participation in the circular economy, right? So there's many examples I talk about in the TED Talk, and actually what's been cool since the TED Talks come out, there's been even more examples. But one that I like to think about is in the city of San Antonio, where they have many kind of incentives that help out with circular economy. One is if you are reusing items, reusing building infrastructure that was already in place, you can get a up to 5-year property tax reduction by doing so. And if anyone lives in Texas, they know how important property taxes reductions could be. So in Massachusetts, for instance, the state of Massachusetts has made it illegal to throw away mattresses and textiles. But in doing so, right, they have all these kind of recycling bins where you can dump your mattress or you can dump your textiles, and they create a website. So it's really easy to figure out where to donate that stuff or where to drop those things. So we have to do 3 things at once, which I know is tough, right? I know it's tough. We got to have the technology and software like Rheaply. We got to have the infrastructure of the people who move and rebuild and repair and rebuild things. And then we have to have our public policy friends helping us out and encouraging participation. But it turns out we've done this before. We did this in COVID. No matter what side of the aisle we're on, no matter what we really believe from an ideology perspective, we said to ourselves, it's too important not to wear a mask, not to pass smart legislation around being safe, and about thinking about our neighbor, about thinking about not just our own health, but thinking about our community and what can we do. So even if I'm not sick, wearing a mask helps my neighbor. And we got hit over the face with that pandemic. It turns out we have 7 years. We have less than 80 months to do the same thing again, which is to care for our neighbor, not just our own home, to say, there's something I can and we can do to prevent these horrific 2050 scenarios by doing something in the next 7 years. And I think that just starts, as I say in the TED Talk, by simply sharing the things locally we no longer need. It's that simple. It's not building a pipeline. It's not building new EV infrastructure, which is cool, and we need that too. But if you're asking yourself, what can I do? What can my business do today? I'm a CFO. I'm a head of procurement. I'm the head of real estate. I'm the head of sustainability. Or I'm just an employee who cares. The thing you can do is join the circular movement, which is just trying to share things locally that you no longer need and trying to purchase things locally that have been reused or recycled that you might.
Garry, I think a perfect ending to this podcast. We'll of course link up the TED Talk in the show notes for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, so you can hear more from Garry. But thank you so much. I want to leave our listeners with that message. I think that's really powerful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Reuse, be circular. It's so easy and cool.